Welcome to Season 2 of the Cultural Kultivators podcast by Belike Creative and Kultivate Labs, where we delve into various aspects of Fil-Am culture and speak with entrepreneurs, leaders, artists, and creators who are shaping and pushing the boundaries of their respective fields. So join us this October as we cultivate a greater appreciation for Filipino American history. Follow us on all social media platforms at Belike Creative or on Instagram at cultural.cultivators. Creative and cultivators are both with a K. Because October is Filipino American History Month, I'm excited to introduce Sondy Lucille. Sondy is a Filipino and Mauritian documentary filmmaker whose personal work discusses mixed heritage and Asian diasporic experiences. In 2023, Sondy was selected as an artist disruptor by the Center for Cultural Power and California Arts Council. With their generous support, she created Dear Watsonville, a mixed media documentary film about the first Filipino migrants to arrive to the U.S. called the Manong generation. This short documentary distinguishes itself from its experimental use of community-sourced oral histories, archival images, and hand-drawn illustrations. Together, these elements weave a moving narrative about resilience, placemaking, and childhood. Dear Watsonville was closely developed with producers Malia Simon Reynolds and Christina Eiston Plank, the co-directors of the Watsonville is in the Heart archive, which all archival images and oral histories are sourced from. In this conversation, Sondy delves deep into the historical legacies of the Manong generation and the role we have to play as Fil-Ams living in their afterglow.
Even though I'm not a descendant of the Manong and we have a different migration story to the United States, I still felt responsible because they're the first group of Filipinos to come to the U.S. and establish communities, establish the beginnings of what Filipino American identity is, what Filipino American culture is. And so every group of Filipinos that come after them inherit the hard work they put in to establish those communities and establish that culture and identity. We are affected by and benefit from the reputation that they created here and the communities and culture that they created here. And so we owe it to them to know who they are and to know their stories, to know their names. So even though Filipinos came in different waves and we have different relationships to the Philippines, maybe are speaking different dialects and have different immigration stories, I think that we can still have solidarity with one another and pay respect to the Manong generation in this country.
Also in this conversation, Sondy shares practical interview tips, fellowship programs for emerging filmmakers, and uplifts the work of Watsonville's in the Heart, a digital archive dedicated to critical community-engaged research of the Manong generation's descendants. You can follow Sondy and Dear Watsonville on Instagram at sondy.lu or at Dear Watsonville. Discover the work of Watsonville's in the Heart archive on Instagram at wiith.ucsc. We're so excited to kick off Filipino American History Month with you and your project.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Before we get into it and tell our listeners what you're up to, which ancestors would you like to call into this conversation today?
I'd love to call in my grandfathers from both sides, as well as my great-grandparents from both sides.
Amazing. You talk about both of your sides. You're actually mixed Filipino Mauritian. And how did that identity and your upbringing as mixed Filipino Mauritian impacted your filmmaking and artistry?
Yeah, so I'm half Filipino and half Mauritian. And if you don't know, Mauritius is a small island off the coast of Madagascar, southeast of Africa, the continent. Yeah, so I grew up in a very multicultural household and navigating both those heritages and cultures and those identities. And so I grew up with a lot of questions and insecurities around identity. And the way I coped with that was by researching the history of each country as well as the culture, doing a lot of research into my family histories. And so that searching has impacted me as a person and, of course, my work as an artist. So a lot of my work has to do with Asian diasporic experiences, with mixed heritage, mixed identity, and how globalization affects our identities.
Amazing. So I wanted to talk specifically about your most recent film called Dear Watsonville. And why was this project important to you to take on? And what was your initial motivation to dig deeper into these stories?
Yeah, so it's about the Manong descendants in Watsonville, California, and how they remember their childhoods and their parents growing up in the farming town. The film itself is inspired by a digital archive called Watsonville is in the Heart. And this archive works directly with Manong descendants in the Pajaro Valley to document and preserve the memories of the Manong. So everything is seen through the eyes of their children, but we do things, or the archive does things like scanning family albums and photos, letters to and from the Philippines, newspaper clippings, and the archive also conducts oral history interviews with the Manong descendants. So I was introduced to this archive by the co-directors Malay and Christina, and I was immediately so drawn to these stories and moved by them, and I could relate to a lot of the sentiments that the descendants had about their parents and their childhoods and their upbringing. And we believed that these stories warranted the evocative medium of film. So that was the initial inspiration and motivation. And the other thing is, I don't think a lot of Americans, let alone Filipino Americans, know about this history. And when we do talk about this history, if we do at all talk about this history, I think a lot of the focus is on Delano and Stockton in San Francisco, places where the Filipino community is larger, but Watsonville is often overlooked. And if you hear about Watsonville, it's usually about the 1930s race riots. So our main motivation with this film was to not only put Watsonville on the map and talk about Watsonville and talk about the Filipino community there, but also look beyond the arduous labor of the Manong and look beyond the violence and racism and talk about their humanity and the communities that they built, the culture that they established, the families that they built, talk about them as storytellers, as parents.
Can we talk more about the process? What was the decision behind choosing Joanne, Dan, and Manuel as the main narrators?
Yeah, so when I was first introduced to the archive, I went through so many family collections. And I while we're on this topic, I encourage every Filipino American to visit this archive because it is such a powerful resource. And I find so much joy going through the photos and the oral histories and listening to everybody's stories. Yeah, so when Malay and Christina introduced me to the archive, and I went through it for the first time, I looked through so many family collections and listened to so many oral history interviews. And we were immediately drawn to Dan, Manuel, and Joanne because they were such natural, descriptive storytellers. The way they talked about their parents and their childhoods was so emotional, and they were also the narrators that we could relate to a lot, and they were super charismatic. And also what's key is that they were very willing to be a part of this film, which took 2 years. It became a very involved process. So we knew that we needed people that were willing to go through that with us. We also took a trip to Watsonville and spent hours and hours with them and bonded. And so we developed a strong relationship with them, with those three narrators. They each offered kind of a different perspective on the history, and they all were great storytellers, but they told the story in different ways. We also wanted to highlight female perspectives too, so it was nice to include Joanne, and it was nice to include Dan as he talks about his mother.
What I loved about the film was that it was so different from what I'm used to as far as documentary style films. What was the decision and the intention behind mixed media? And what was the process like when collaborating with artists like Lauren and Juliet?
We chose to have a mixed media approach because we wanted to emphasize the significance of emotional memory. When we were listening to their oral histories and in conversation with Joanne, Dan, and Manuel, what stood out to us was how they felt about their parents, how they felt about their childhood homes and experiences. And so we were searching for a unique visual language that would communicate that to viewers who weren't in those rooms with us and weren't listening to the entire oral histories, because some of them could be 2 to 4 hours long. Immediately, Lauren Song came to mind. They are an incredible illustrator, and I felt like they could communicate so much story and emotion in just one frame. So I brought them in, and then eventually Juliet as well, because Juliet is a wonderful storyboard artist and visual development artist. And so together, all of us were searching for what that visual language would be. And so we landed on mixed media, combining hand-drawn illustrations and archival images, because we felt like the archival images could ground the film in the authentic representation of these people, and the illustrations could bring out those emotions from the oral history interviews. And it was also an opportunity to incorporate some more dreamlike or surrealist imagery to emphasize, again, those emotions and those memories of their parents.
That was my next question. I love this use of, like you said, dreamlike imagery and these dynamic illustrations, like the enlarged tiger shark from Joanne's memory of her father, or Manuel's father with his rooster head.
These are two great examples because they're the most explicit manipulation of reality. For Joanne, with the enlarged tiger shark that her father brings home, we wanted to emphasize the impression it left on her. When I listened to her story, it stood out to me how she felt about her father being this hero figure. She really admired him and still does. And she describes that memory of him bringing home this huge tiger shark with so much like childlike wonder and admiration for her father. And so we emphasized the size of the shark to capture that. And also when you're a kid, everything just seems so big. And because she's telling that story from the point of view of a little girl, we were like, oh, well, how do we communicate that with imagery? And that was one of the ways we communicated that. And then with Manuel and his father with the rooster head, where we took the most liberties, we wanted to find a way to communicate Manuel's disconnect with his father when he was growing up. They had a rough relationship growing up, and it was only until Manuel's adulthood that he began to understand and empathize with his father a lot more. And this is something he emphasizes in his own personal story. But we had to cut it down to 4 to 5 minutes, right? So how do we communicate that effectively using our illustrations? And that was the way that we landed. Also, he was a rooster fighter. It was a huge part of his identity. And Manuel describes him as a rebel because of his rooster fighting and because of his involvement with the labor union and things like that. So we thought it might be an evocative visual metaphor in a way to make him into a humanoid rooster. And then at the end of the film, he becomes just a man, with a regular head and a regular man's body. And hopefully what that communicates is that newfound empathy and connection that Manuel feels with him in the end, and just sees him for who he was and comes to understand him in a new way.
I always say here at the podcast, always take the chance you can with your elders and folks that you love to ask them questions. Because just like you were saying about Manuel's relationship with his father, you don't really get to empathize with your parents until you start to ask questions and you start to put those puzzle pieces together on why they are the way they are and how they're just trying to do their best.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another thing that I could relate to in Manuel's story is not really fully understanding my parents and grandparents growing up, and then only coming to a new understanding. I won't say that I completely understand them now, but a new understanding as an adult, kind of reassessing the situation more from a different lens and trying to be more objective and trying to understand them, putting in that effort and asking them questions, seeing them in a context like larger than just being my parent or grandparent. And that's what Manuel was doing. And that was one of the things that resonated with me when hearing his story and talking to him about his father.
Were there any other moments that you experienced or resonated with you during this process of creating Dear Watsonville that you've taken on since the project has completed?
Oh gosh. Yes, I think there's a piece in a lot of their stories and a lot of the oral histories that I could relate to. Like memories that I hadn't accessed in a long time. What I also really liked about these oral histories and talking with the Manong descendants is they're second generation Filipinos. So this is actually a very deeply Filipino American story. These are deeply Filipino American stories as they're told by their children. And it reminds me that our experience as Filipino Americans is distinct. It's unique. The experience of being raised in this country and having a little bit of a disconnect to the Philippines and Filipino culture, but longing for that connection and longing for that kind of community and building that community in this country is a distinct and unique experience. And I think we often feel between worlds, like between being American and being Filipino and not feeling enough in either category. But I think that experience in itself is its own thing, and we find solidarity with one another because we all experience that struggle. And so our Filipino culture becomes something new, and it evolves. And I think a lot of Filipino Americans can relate to that and can relate to that sentiment. And so they don't really talk about that explicitly in the oral history interviews, but it's something that I feel when I'm in community with them and when I listen to their stories. And it's another thing that drew me to this project. It's about the Manong, like first and foremost, but this reflection on their parents, this reflection on their heritage feels very second generation Filipino to me. And I love that about this story and about this project too. Have you visited the archive?
I have not. It's in Watsonville, you said?
Yeah, well, it's a digital archive, so you can visit it online. I believe it's wiith.ucsc.edu.
What often happens in academia for someone that went through the ethnic studies program, it feels so far removed when you're reading about it in a book. Right? Especially if you and your family have not gone through it. Maybe your family has come in the 80s and 90s during like the third wave of nurses that came to America from the Philippines. So it feels so far removed. But to actually sit down with the descendants, like the people that you interviewed, you realized it wasn't that long ago. It really was 3 generations ago when these Manongs lived and struggled and sacrificed so much to open doors for all of us. And I'm not just going to say me and my family, but for all of the Filipinos that are here, and the racism and the struggles that they endured just to exist in America. And so what I loved about Watsonville is in the Heart and the Archives is that it really shows you that there's no disconnect. Like you said, there's solidarity and community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that because I also want to give a little shout out to the archive as they engage in something that I learned about. I learned about this working with Malay and Christina, they're the co-directors of the archive and they're historians. They also were the producers on the film, which was very educational for me. They taught me a lot about research and archiving. And the archive's research philosophy uses something called critical community engaged research, which values community members as expert knowledge producers. So they work with them. It's not kind of this extraction of knowledge and information. They are hand in hand creating this archive together and documenting this history together. And I think that's another reason why it's a powerful resource. And yeah, it doesn't feel disconnected. And when you're reading about Filipino American history through Watsonville is in the Heart, it doesn't feel like this third-person omniscient observer. It feels very personal. And it's easy to connect with the stories. So I think that's another reason why it's a great place for you to go if you're curious about Filipino American history.
Even for those Filipinos in Virginia who listen to us, or Idaho, or Florida who don't have the opportunity to attend an ethnic studies class, to have a Filipino teach you about these histories, this website is a perfect way for you to do the research on your own.
I thought about this a lot because I'm not descended from the Manong, but I still felt deeply connected to these stories in this community. I think as a Filipino American who's an artist and a filmmaker, being raised in California, I immediately was drawn to these stories and felt responsible to tell them when Malay and Christina approached me. Even though I'm not a descendant of the Manong and we have a different migration story to the United States, I still felt responsible because they're the first group of Filipinos to come to the US and establish communities, establish, the beginnings of what Filipino American identity is, what Filipino American culture is. And so every group of Filipinos that come after them inherit the hard work they put in to establish those communities and establish that culture and identity. We are affected by and benefit from the reputation that they created here and the communities and culture that they created here. And so we owe it to them to know who they are and to know their stories, to know their names. So even though Filipinos came in different waves and we have different relationships to the Philippines, maybe are speaking different dialects and have different immigration stories, I think that we can still have solidarity with one another and pay respect to the Manong generation in this country.
Thank you for saying that. Seeing a project like this is so inspiring for me as a filmmaker and creative myself. I really just have to give you and your team flowers and appreciation. This is like a huge, huge success. I follow you all on social media. I see all the film festivals and the exhibits that you've been highlighted in for Asian Americans and also Filipino American audiences. So now that you're in the film festival circuit, what meaningful insights have you gained from folks who view the film or any kind of feedback that you've gotten?
Thank you. It definitely was a team effort. Joanne, Dan, and Manuel were a huge help. Malay and Christina were like incredible producers. And then, of course, Juliet and Lauren, I leaned on them so much. And yeah, we all kind of held each other's hands, and it was a 2-year project. So of course, we're like different people by the end. And there were definitely instances where we got really, because we all have jobs on top of this film. And so there are definitely weekends and nights where we're tired and we just had to like take a break or go do a retreat in Watsonville and just hang out in community to replenish ourselves and, keep doing this project. So anyways, thank you so much. We just started the festival circuit, so we're still new and we're still in the beginnings, screenings across the US, but mostly in California. I think my favorite part has been talking to Filipino Americans after the screening about this history. And what I've learned is a lot of people don't know about the Manong generation, let alone Watsonville. I think the film is for everyone, but I think it's specifically for Filipino Americans. It was made with them in mind. And I think because I was exposed to so much of this history, I forgot that just baseline Manong history, baseline Filipino American history is not commonly known, which is a bummer because we've been here for a long time and we've affected this country's history and culture for a long time. But I'm glad that I feel like it's starting to get a lot of recognition. I don't know if it's just because I'm in a bubble because I'm working on this film, but I feel like it's starting to get a lot of recognition, which is awesome. So after the film, I've talked to a lot of young Filipino Americans and also all ages Filipino Americans about this history. The one thing that has been super cool is how this film has inspired and encouraged people to start looking into their own family history and documenting it, which is another goal of the film. I'd love for more Filipino Americans to look into their family histories and document it, just like what you're doing. I think it's dope. Look at memoirs, look at family albums, look at that discarded box in the garage that has like 8mm in it, You gotta be curious. And I think that's awesome. Those have been my favorite conversations after the film.
I will say this, the pandemic gave me this beautiful gift where I had nothing to do during lockdown, so I just cleaned my mom's garage. I was staying with her. I lived in New York, actually, for 10 years, and during lockdown, I decided to move back in with my mom. And so when I moved back in, I went through her garage. I went through an old file cabinet that she had since the 80s, and I found like 20 letters from my grandma.
Oh my gosh.
Documenting her life, her childhood, just struggling here in America, her first marriage, her second marriage. It was just so interesting, and stories I had never heard of, learning that our descendants were Muslim chieftains in Mindanao. Yeah. And that one of them was Datu Biru, who like back in the days, like the nannies and stuff would, or the yayas would tell her, if you don't act right, Datu Biru's ghost gonna haunt you. And she was like, that's my grandfather. Like, so it was so amazing. And I had never heard these stories before. And I don't even know if my mother knew a lot of these stories. And so I 100% agree. Ask your elders questions. Ask your Lola, ask your Lolo. Ask them to dust off those old photo albums. Have them write their experiences. Sometimes people don't want to talk. Sometimes it's easier for them to write about it in like a journal or something, because when they pass on, then those stories can continue living.
Yeah, definitely. I learned a lot working. I do a lot of documentary filmmaking work, and I do a lot of family history work, personal family history work, where I interrogate everybody in my family, even the ones that don't want to talk. And one way that I've learned that you can get the ones that don't want to talk is just writing. And no camera, no recorder. Sometimes that just makes people really nervous. Just writing, or, pointing to a photo and be like, oh, like, what did it smell like that day? Do you remember what you had for lunch? Like, what's this dessert I see here? Being very curious with the light stuff. And they might not want to go heavy, but you can start collecting a lot of clues just asking really light stuff. Like, oh, what was your favorite color? What was your favorite jacket? What was your favorite song? It can give you a lot of insight into what they were like.
Those are great tips. I think a lot of the feedback I get from friends or folks who want to do these interviews is, oh, my parents don't want to be recorded. Asking about the lighter stuff, but just having the flexibility and having that safe space, I think, too. Like, cook for them, like, make it inviting, make it an inviting environment. Don't just like stick a camera in their face and say, talk about your life. I think that's really good advice because, again, I think the pandemic gave me this beautiful gift to like slow down and really like find these letters, but also interview my mom in a way that was like inviting and warm and allowing her to sort of put down her walls around her childhood. And that like totally blew my mind open about like why she is the way she is.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm glad that you had that. That's wonderful. I'm still trying to get my dad to open up a little more. And he's a little more sentimental in his years right now. So I'm really grateful for that.
And so what was the experience like for the descendants that got to see this film after it was done? Like Joanne, Dan, and Manuel, what were their thoughts on the film?
Oh gosh, this was the audience we were the most nervous for because we were representing their stories and we really wanted them to like it. So we had a first look together at the Sowing Seeds exhibition. We had a moment after the opening night where we just sat, just us, together and watched it. And we were really relieved to learn that they liked it. Particularly, I didn't know how Manuel would react to seeing his father depicted the way he was depicted. We had talked to Manuel a lot during the process of making the film, but we hadn't really shown him any visuals. But he liked it. He got a kick out of it. He was like, oh yeah, we used to call him Chicken Max, so that seems apt. And I was like, wow, perfect. So there is no better screening. That's still our most cherished memory and our most cherished screening together was watching with Joanne, Dan, and Manuel in person at the exhibition, in the context of the exhibition, which is, I think, the best way to consume the film. Sadly, the exhibition is no longer up. It ended on August 4th, but anyway, that was kind of sad. The film is still good if you watch it on its own, but that was our most cherished screening, was with Joanne, Dan, and Manuel, that little private screening.
Do you think there's an opportunity for that exhibition to maybe travel to like the Asian Art Museum or somewhere closer to San Francisco?
I would love that. Malay and Christina are the co-directors and co-curators, so I think they're probably working on that, but I won't speak for them. I would love for that to happen. I mean, it was such a wonderful exhibition, and so many second generation and first generation Filipinos showed up from NorCal. And so not only walking around the exhibition, reading and looking at the material items and photographs and watching the film, not only was that really cool, it was cool to do that with other Filipino Americans, and the conversations that the exhibit sparked was super, super special. So I'd love for that to continue on.
Well, we're going to manifest it. I'm going to manifest it.
Yes.
Yes.
Good vibes. Good vibes.
So, for those that don't know your work, you not only do independent documentary film, but you also work in the industry for the bigger budgeted stuff. What advice would you have for young emerging filmmakers who are looking to put themselves and their own work out there, whether it's independent or big budget studio stuff?
That's a great question. It's also always hard for me to answer this question because I forget that I was going to say, like, sometimes I still feel like I'm young and emerging. So I'm like, what do I need to do? But I guess my best advice would be the pretty typical advice. I really like what Gail said on your podcast, which is just create and put it out there and don't even worry about it being mediocre. Just make your goal 80% and not 100%, because then you'll put more out. And the more you get used to putting things out, you get in a rhythm and you start to, I don't know, you put less pressure on yourself, especially if you're a perfectionist and just never release anything. I'm definitely guilty of that. I think like 70% of my work is unreleased because I'm just so self-conscious. I think it's kind of a lost art to just make art and kick it out and just continue. It's just a way of expressing. It's like a diary entry. It doesn't always have to be a blockbuster, make you a bunch of money. It's really just a way for humans to express themselves and preserve, this time and place and how they're feeling in this time and place. And that's super, super valuable, especially if you're Filipino American, especially if you're from a minority group in this country. But that's very good advice that I've heard and has helped me just push work out. It also is a way for you to start creating your own experience, because I think a huge barrier to entry is production and post-production experience. And sometimes when you can't get your foot in the door, you just got to create the project yourself. And you can do unconventional things, like look into the experimental spaces and the just media art in general spaces and free yourself from the shackles of filmmaking rules, I think is really helpful for me too. Another thing that's been great and really impactful for me and my career has been film fellowships, especially those geared toward Asian American and Pacific Islander or BIPOC in general fellowships. And one that I've done is called if you're in LA, it's called Armed with a Camera, and it's a program by Visual Communication. So things like that I think are super, super helpful, especially for new filmmakers who are just getting used to the space and creation.
Amazing. Thank you. All right. We're almost to the end. Can you share any insights and any upcoming projects that you might be excited about and how they might differ or even build on your previous work?
I have a lot of ideas. Dear Watsonville was a huge, huge project. So now that it's come to a close and we're doing festivals, my mind is freeing up a little bit to think about what I want to do next. I recently came across my great-great-grandfather's memoir on my Filipino side. Shout out Mariano for leaving that behind for his descendants to read. And I'd love to do something with that to honor his memory and his legacy. I also am writing my first narrative script, and it's a comedy based in my hometown. So those are the two things brewing. We'll see what comes of that. My hometown is Riverside, California. I had a great time. I was kind of a hooligan, and to be honest, I was not doing well in school for a long time. But I had a great time. I felt really supported by my community out there. And I got into film thanks to Riverside. Riverside had this program called Off the Arts Block by UCR and RCC people. And that's where I learned how to edit, was there. I was just kind of fooling around every summer until that program. And then I was like, it was like a way to spend my time a little more productively. And I learned Final Cut and Premiere Pro with mentors there and started making, speaking of pushing out content, it was such a playful space to just make films.
All right, so last question, what are you currently geeking over?
Okay, I love this question. I was excited when you sent these over. I'm reading The Reckoning of Roku by Randy Rebai. Do you know this? Okay, I'm a huge The Last Airbender fan. Huge nerd since I was a kid. And there are these novels that expand the world and are kind of the prequels. So the current, or in the Avatar The Last Airbender, Aang is the Avatar and he's an airbender, da-da-da. And so before him is Roku. He's a firebender and he was the Avatar before him. And so there's a book out called The Reckoning of Roku. And the author is a Filipino American. Randy's Filipino. And I'm reading it and I love it. I'm not done yet. I think I'm on page 130. There's already references to pre-colonial Philippines here and there. Like there's a Babayan tribe. But yeah, so I'm reading that. I'm having so much fun. I'm waiting to finish it before I watch it and read interviews because I don't want any spoilers. But yeah.
All right, Sondy, thank you so much for being on our podcast and talking about Dear Watsonville and all things film. We really appreciate you, and we're sending you all the good vibes for the rest of the film festival run. And if you ever want to show it in Soma, Pilipinas, let me know. I'll make it happen. We have tons of venues and spaces, and we'll help market it too.
Yay, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
What really stood out from this conversation with Sondy is this idea of responsibility, not just for our own stories, but for the stories of those who came before us. To me, it's like a redwood tree or a forest of redwood trees. For those that don't know, the roots of a redwood tree grow only 10 to 13 feet vertically, kind of shallow, but they spread horizontally for 60 to 80 feet, intertwining with the roots of other redwoods for stability. That's what gives them strength. So above ground, they seem like they're growing independently from each other. But underground, they are connected. And even though Sondy doesn't have the same exact migration story as the Manong generation, she felt deeply connected to them, just like those roots of a redwood tree. The Manong generation, they are the roots and the very first samplings, establishing the foundation of the Filipino American experience and culture here in the diaspora. And every wave of Filipinos that came afterward is linked to them. From New Orleans to Seattle to California to New Jersey, whether we realize it or not, we are all connected. And I think the strength and identity we have today, it's built on their sacrifices, their struggles, and of course, their successes. During Filipino American History Month, I think it's even more important to honor their legacy by learning their stories, sharing them, and ensuring that their sacrifices, struggles, and triumphs are remembered. Because if it wasn't for the Manongs, like civil rights leader Larry Itliong, or the Manongs of the International Hotel, like my own grandfather, Canito Saliver, who owned the first pool hall and Filipino restaurant in San Francisco's Manila town, if it weren't for them, we may not have Filipinos owning businesses in San Francisco today. We may not have a cultural heritage district called Soma, Pilipinas. So this month is a powerful reminder of the resilience and contributions of these first Filipino Americans. And I think it's our responsibility to not only celebrate their achievements, but recognize the challenges and sacrifices that they faced. By doing so, we keep their legacy alive. We honor the communities they helped build, and we continue to strengthen the roots they planted for future generations. So, take this conversation and this episode as an invitation to remember that despite our different paths, whether through diverse immigration stories or dialects, our roots are deeply connected, providing us with strength, solidarity, and love across generations. And just like the intertwined roots of a redwood tree, our stories and identities are woven together, making us stronger and more resilient as we grow and reach new heights together. Cultural Kultivators is hosted by me, Nicole Saliver. You can follow me at Kindred Kapwa or follow us at cultural.cultivators on Instagram. The podcast is co-produced by John Reyes, Kindred Kapwa, and Belay Creative, and it is a product of Cultivate Labs. Stay in touch at belaycreative.org, and happy Filipino American History Month.